The Deer Farming Channel is brought to you by Rafter P Construction. Stick around to learn more about Rafter P's design build process and, of course, the biggest deer in the world. We've included a list of all the topics in this interview, which you can access by clicking the text at the bottom of the video. So howdy everybody, my name is Keith Warren. I host a television program called Deer and Wildlife Stories, and if you're concerned about chronic wasting disease, this video, I believe, is going to be very informative, and I think that you're going to walk away having a different perspective on it. Joining me is Dr. Christopher Seabury. He is the leading scientist and researcher for the North American Deer Registry. So this video is going to be a question-answer video, if you will. I'm going to ask Dr. Seabury lots of questions, and I want you to pay attention, and hopefully you'll replay this to get some of your questions answered. And so before we get started, I want to tell you a little bit about Dr. Seabury. He's a hunter, okay? He's a fisherman, and he grew up hunting and fishing, and he loves the outdoors. And so tell everybody, why is it that you're so passionate about getting this just research out?
I mean, I see it as an emerging, obstacle to our ability to use our land for what we love. And, I don't want that to be something that inhibits us or the future generations from being able to enjoy our properties the way that we like to, hunting and fishing. And so CWD is an obstacle for even young people who might want to go out hunting because they hear all these stories and whatnot in the media, and we need to suppress the prevalence of the disease with every tool that we have available. And so this is just one of those tools, one tool that may have a greater impact than others.
So different states have been more impacted by CWD than others, and the thing I look at is CWD is an issue that potentially could really hurt hunting, not just deer farming, but hurt hunting in general. And so I want to tell you, with this new research that's available, this new breeding tool, if you will, I'm extremely bullish on our industry. I think that there's a lot of upside for our industry. I think that business is going to be very, very good down the road by those that are using this technology to help breed CWD out of your herd. Now, before we get started, I want to talk about when this first started. I know there was a lot of talk about resistance versus susceptibility. Okay, and before we even get started, I want Dr. Seabury to cover the difference between resistance and susceptibility, because it's extremely important as we go through this video.
People would always say that they wanted to breed for resistance, but we haven't found sort of a single genotype yet that has rendered deer completely and fully resistant. That doesn't necessarily mean that they don't exist, but what we know is what we know today about the deer that we have. And with the breeding tool, we can always make better deer. So we may inevitably make deer in the future through selective breeding that are resistant. But right now, what we're dealing with is a spectrum of susceptibility that we know for sure. So we can identify moderately to highly susceptible deer and not use them in a breeding program so that we can engage in genetic improvement. Full resistance would mean the deer is incapable of being infected. And although some deer like that may exist out there, it's difficult to put your finger on those deer. And what we need to do is deal with what we can put our finger on, which is moderate to high susceptibility.
Okay, so that leads us into, I'm sure the viewers got a question, how in the world did you come up with this information that you're about to tell everybody about? Just how did you come up with it? I mean, how did you determine who is more and who is less susceptible to CWD?
Well, we used the federal repository of samples that are from herds that were indemnified and depopulated because they were CWD positive. A lot of those herds reached a prevalence that was even 50, 60, 70+% CWD positive, and they were left on the ground for a while for various reasons. So there were still a proportion of the deer that remained non-detect over a long period of time. So it becomes difficult to say that they were never exposed to the disease. And we just started looking at their genetics. We First, what we did was do complete genome sequencing on a large number of deer that were from these indemnified herds, and we built a genotyping technology, and we just asked a simple question, you know, is there any genetics that are overrepresented among the deer that are positive, and any that are overrepresented among the deer that remain non-detect at these sites? And I'm oversimplifying, but through that exercise, we could identify with no ambiguity what genetics were associated with increasing levels of susceptibility and what genetics were associated with reduced susceptibility at increasing levels.
Okay, so you developed a scale, if you will,
Yeah.
to be able to determine where a deer genetically lies on this susceptibility scale.
Right.
Okay, tell everybody about that.
It's just the old number line from your grade school days where 0 is, for instance, let's just put 0 in the middle, and we can go on the positive side of 0 or on the negative side of 0. And if you're on the positive side of 0, then you are enriched for alleles that increase susceptibility to some varying degree because it's a scale. If you're on the negative side of the scale, on the left, for instance, then the deer is enriched for alleles that have protective effects against CWD in some varying degree. And, you know, not all deer are created equally in terms of where they stand on that scale. And so the tool tells you where do you stand on an individual basis, but it also tells you where do you stand in your overall breeding herd, even as an average value or just among the animals that you're using for breeding. And then you can actually be informed what deer to breed to go in the direction you want to go, which is the negative direction.
Okay, so we're going to tell you how you can go about submitting samples here later in the video. But as we look at this baseline, as you've been calling it, and where does it start? What are you trying to shoot for on this baseline, and why?
When I first did this, I had to make a baseline cutoff number because the goal was to test the research hypothesis that deer with reduced susceptibility would be falling within a certain range of the breeding values. And so I had to come up with a way to calculate a cutoff value that was the benchmark. And when I did that and I tested that hypothesis, I found that there was a significant overrepresentation of deer that did not pass the cutoff, that were CWD positive, okay? And so I kept applying that benchmark when I was doing the blind validation project. I would receive batches of samples from USDA. I would predict on them to come up with the breeding values. I would tell them which ones didn't pass the cutoff, and I would say the ones that didn't pass the cutoff, if there's any positives here, they're most likely among the ones that didn't pass. And I would submit it like an exam, and they would grade it and send it back and reveal to me what the CWD diagnostic status was for those samples. And overall, it worked pretty well. I ended up at 88, 89% on average. Some batches I caught 100%. Some batches I only caught, 75%. But it was an 87, 88% average across all batches. So it seemed to work much better than anything else that we had at our disposal at the time.
Okay, so basically sum it up. He took samples from depopulated herds and in blind testing.
Yeah.
That's important. It's blind testing. He had no idea what deer was what.
Right.
He's looking at all these different deer and the numbers where they go on this baseline, this score, if you will. And then he was able to predict with that high of accuracy which ones were likely to be CWD positive.
Right.
And that's just basically the further away from that high score you can get down below 0, the less likely it was to have CWD.
Right. The probability of being CWD positive would decrease rapidly as the breeding values become more negative because the animal is becoming more and more enriched for protective alleles.
So the bottom line is you're able to now, with this breeding value, you're able to take a look at this, and this is nothing but just a different characteristic that you can breed for, correct?
Yes. I mean, it's like any other trait that you want to breed for, only now it's a number. So for instance, if you have two deer that are really good deer in terms of both of them, buck and a doe, have a good breeding value, then the offspring are either going to outperform the parents or they're going to fall on the other side from the parents when they have really close breeding values. It'll be like any other trait. You'll notice that certain pairings work better than others in terms of bucks and does.
Okay, so the predecessor to this test was a good start. Would you address that with everybody?
Yes, it was a start that was really invigorated by sheep and sheep scrapie, because we know that there's one gene in sheep and a couple places in that gene that are variable that explain most of the susceptibility to scrapie. So it was assumed in the beginning that it would work in deer with chronic wasting disease the same as it worked in sheep. In order to confirm whether that assumption is valid, you have to do what I did, which is do a whole genome test. So what we do in the breeding tool, we include that gene is included in the data when we calculate the breeding value. But in the run-up to this, we also tested whether or not you can validly scientifically assume that you can just take the sheep approach and it's going to work. And the answer is no. There's too many other genetic elements that are beneficial that you will be leaving out and not using if you don't take the whole genome breeding tool approach, which will use the gene, but it uses tens of thousands of other pieces of genetic information that are helpful in reducing susceptibility.
So when you started this, it sounds like to me there are now two different levels, two different things you're looking at. The first off is the codon, okay? And then the next is going to be your score, your breeding score, correct?
The codons are included in the calculation of the breeding value.
So NADAR will provide that when you get this back.
Right.
In your score sheet, you're going to find out what codon it is.
Yes.
As well as what your score is.
Right.
Okay. So looking at the codons, there's been a lot of talk in the past about Ks and Gs and all these different codons out there.
Right.
What codon, in your opinion, is where people need to go and why?
Our whole genome test showed that codon 96 has the strongest effects on susceptibility versus protection. So deer that are 96 GG have a weakness. The S allele at codon 96 has the strongest protective effects of any other allele that we had in a whole genome approach. So, you need to get away from 96 GGs, and the second best codon is 95H. The so-called HS deer that people are making, those are GS and they have an H at 95. You still need to take into consideration the breeding values, because when I did the blind validation, I didn't rank the samples based on codon 96. I didn't bias anything about what samples I thought would be where the positives were going to be found in any way except ranking them based on the cutoff for the breeding values. But you have to understand that when you get your breeding values back and you have two deer, for instance, that have negative breeding values and they're GS at 96, you have an opportunity then, if it's a buck and a doe, to breed those deer together and to get SS fawns that could have even more superior breeding values, that could be even more enriched for protective alleles than the parents were. And when I did the blind validation, it was just a one-step thing. I couldn't go any further. I couldn't breed animals. I couldn't make them better than what I had to work with. I could only report on what I had. Mm-hmm. And that's what people don't understand, is that cutoff was the benchmark to show that it worked, and that there was clustering of positive deer that didn't pass the cutoff versus those that were non-detect, which did pass the cutoff, right? But then the cutoff itself is a guide for you. Because if you want to have the best breeding program you can, if you start with deer that are at the cutoff or that are exceeding the cutoff, you will reach your goal much faster than trying to start way over on the positive side of the scale.
Okay, so getting back to the codon, so you're saying the SS96 is really the superior spot where you want to be, correct?
Yeah, you want to get away from GGs at 96.
Okay. So in the past, when somebody submits a sample, and we'll tell you how to go ahead and submit a sample in a minute, but in the past, when somebody submitted a sample, it was primarily for parentage.
Right.
Okay. And now, when you submit a sample, you can submit a sample for parentage, or there's going to be an upcharge if you want to submit it and get it tested with the genetic breeding value. Okay, so, but basically there are 3 tests that are being done now, right?
3. Because as you pointed out, the earlier approach was looking at the codons only. That was being offered as a test. Parentage was being offered as a test. And now the breeding values, they're all bundled together so that you can get your parentage, the codons, and the breeding values, because you know, it doesn't make any sense not to use all the beneficial information. If you get your breeding values back and you look at the codons and you see, for instance, that you have a really good deer with a really good breeding value, let's say negative 0.35, and it's a 96 GG, but then and it's a buck. And then you got a doe that maybe is a negative 0.2, but it's an SS. You can move that good genetic background from that 96 GG doe into fawns, right, that are GS, and then you can offload that particular breeding animal after you have moved that good genetic background in there, so that you are accomplishing your goal, which should be make the breeding values as negative as possible and move away from 96 GG deer.
Okay, so let's talk about samples. All right, so what you do for a sample, in the past, just for parentage, we could pull a hair. Okay, we could wind up submit antler or even semen to get that. What is the best way to get a sample for nadar to do this genetic breeding value?
Those TSU tubes that have the applicator that you get an ear punch from, that's probably the best way, because there's a protective buffer in there that protects the DNA, and the size of the tissue punch is sufficient to do a lot of DNA testing in case something new comes up in the future or that animal needs to be revisited. It can just stay there and be stable for DNA for a good bit of time.
So the quality of the DNA that comes from the tissue sample is better than the quality that comes from hair or antler or even semen? Typically,
the quantity and the quality of DNA is better from the tissue tube than it is from other. The worst would be antler core. Antler core is the most difficult to deal with. It has the smallest amount of DNA, and the DNA is usually fragmented, damaged, just because it's desiccated and it's been, just sitting out at room temperature, whatever it is. And those are more challenging to make work than the tissue tubes.
Okay, so what you're going to wind up doing, most people are wind up on newborn fawns taking this tissue sample out of their ear, and they'll actually use that hole for a pilot hole, if you will, for the permanent ear tag.
Right.
It's going to go in the ear. And so you're going to take that tissue sample and you're going to put it in a box, and it's got a little barcode on it, and you're going to send it off to NADAR. Okay, NADAR at that point processes it and then sends it off to the laboratory.
Right.
Okay, then explain to them what happens at that point.
At the laboratory, which is in Lincoln, Nebraska, NADAR uses GeneSeq Neogen. The DNA is extracted from the tissue punch using a robotic process that is, it's in place for efficiency, but it's also in place to reduce human errors associated with handling samples. The DNA is extracted and it is essentially hybridized to almost like a computer chip, almost like a little glass slide that has a computer chip on it. And when the DNA is hybridized to that, placed on there, then it can be scanned and it reads back through a computer a genetic profile of that animal in the form of genotypes. And in this case, it's 50,000 genotypes. That data is then joined with the prion data, which has to be obtained through a slightly different process. And it's put together, and then it's sent to me. And when it gets sent to me, it's just barcodes. I ask for the data on purpose to be anonymized, and they're simply named by barcode. So I get the data, then I produce the breeding values, and I send those back to Nader. Usually I turn those around within 24 hours, send them back to Nader, and they distribute those to whoever their customers are.
So once the information is obtained, is that information held private or is it made public for everybody?
No, it's absolutely private. The data is housed in the Nader databases the way that the current Parentage is housed there, but it's not accessible to the public.
I want you to know, while I was preparing for the questions on this interview, I asked a lot of deer breeders at a lot of different events. I said, what would you like me to ask? What are your concerns about this? And so a lot of this stuff that I'm asking is based upon what breeders have asked me to ask. One of the big concerns that comes up, because it is very private. You submit this sample on whatever deer you want, you get the information back, and it could be really good or it could not be really good. Okay, but that's private. But one of the concerns is that information could be shared with law enforcement.
Yeah.
Okay, would you address that, please?
Law enforcement does not have the ability to just get into the Nader database. There have been other groups of people that have wanted to gain access to the Nader database historically, but you know, when Ray Burdett was there, and it didn't happen. So, you know, and it's stored in a careful way over at Nader. So I don't know where law enforcement would get the data, because if Nader's the only people that have it and can decode it, and it's stored in their databases, then, you know, there would have to be a court order or more to get the data.
So is every sample that is sent in to Nader, is it accepted or not?
Well, usually that is like, you know, they say it's antler core and it's some bone fragments that are, you know, highly dried out and too small to drill, and, you know, and so they might try, but there's insufficient DNA to be able to, or insufficient opportunity to get DNA to process the sample any further. So no, you can't just send in anything. It has to be an appropriate sample.
All right, so another question that breeders have had, they said that they've sent in 2 different samples off the same animal, and
right,
they've come back with 2 different results. Explain why they could be.
Yeah, that's kind of an easy answer, because as you said earlier, are all samples created equally? No, they're not, because for instance, if we take a buck and we drill an antler core from a shed antler, and then we also take an ear punch and we extract DNA from both of those materials for the same buck, the antler core DNA is going to be, there'll be less DNA, the quality will be lower, and the ear punch will have more DNA and the quality will be higher, and that affects how much data you get back off the array. And so, for instance, in order for the lab to consider it a successful test, it has to return 90% of the data for the 50K array. Mm-hmm. So that's 90%, or 0.90 times 50,000 gives you 45,000 genotypes, right? That's the minimum spec. But if you have that, you have 45,000 genotypes for the antler core, and then the ear punch gives you 100% data return, and you have 50,000 genotypes. That's 5,000 genotypes worth of difference there, right? Between the 2 samples. And so I have a way, which is a standard way that we do this in statistical genetics and quantitative genetics, to correct that and to make up for that, which also includes me calibrating their samples to everyone else's. And so you can't expect the values, though, to be identical. You're not getting a 6-digit number because I intend for there to be 6 digits of precision. You're getting a 6-digit number because I format all of them that way for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons in this case is if you turn your deer in and you pay $75 and I round it to 2 decimals and I give you your score back and it's a 0, you're not going to feel very satisfied with that, right? I think you want a little more precision than a 0. It's like in school, if you take a test, you get a 0, you know, you're not going to feel very satisfied by that, right? So in order to prevent that from happening, that's why I've gone out more decimals there. It's not because you should send the same sample in and expect them to be identical, unless they perform on the array identically.
Okay, speaking of identical, I want to address another question that people have had, and maybe you've had this one or heard people ask it, but I think it's an important question. How can you take womb mates and they be so different?
Yeah. That too, I think, is an easy question if you think about what a womb mate is. A womb mate is not an identical twin. A womb mate is a fraternal twin. A womb mate is the equivalent of my brother to me. We share 50% of our alleles. Everyone's got friends or a brother or a sister. One's tall and thin, and the other one's short and overweight, right? There's no reason to expect womb mates to perform identically for any trait, because they only share 50% of their alleles. I think it's important to say it is possible that we could create much better deer than what we're dealing with right now through breeding. So for instance, we might be able to get out to a breeding value of negative 0.8, right? Some of those deer might very well be resistant. They could perhaps tolerate a lot of exposure and not amplify it, not become positive. So, you know, we're dealing with what we have right now, and the best tested deer that I've ever seen is about a negative 0.5 or thereabouts, close to that, right? But that is not a hard ceiling. That is only our starting place. And if we continue to go in that direction, then we can perhaps reduce susceptibility so significantly that we do in fact encounter and find deer that are resistant. We just don't know because we haven't done the work yet.
That was on one end.
Yeah.
On the other end is your cutoff point.
Yes.
Okay, so tell everybody what your cutoff point is and what that means and why is it there.
The cutoff point is negative 0.056. If you need a specific reason to make that relevant to you, other than me saying that it was statistically relevant, then assume or ponder the fact that more than 95% of the non-detect deer from positive depopulated facilities have breeding values that are less than that number. So more than 95% of the non-detect deer from positive facilities that were depopulated have breeding values less than that number.
Okay, but that's a starting point, okay? So, and that's good. We got a starting point. But that starting point, we have talked off camera many times, it's like taking a test and getting a D on a test. So address that. That's the lowest point. It's still passing, but it's still the lowest point.
If you need to make it relevant to biology, it is the beginning of meaningful enrichment for alleles that have protective effects, the beginning. And, you know, the more negative you breed the deer, the further and more negative the breeding values become, the more true breeding they will become because they will share more of the protective alleles. So a deer that is negative 0.056, there's a lot of ways that you can end up with that score in terms of different protective alleles that add up to that score. But when you get out to like negative 0.3, for instance, deer that have scores of negative 0.3, they share many, many more of the same protective alleles, and they are much more enriched. So it is the beginning. It was a way to statistically show that it worked and prove it through at least 3 blind tests, really. But it also is a way for the breeder to orient themselves as to what do I have and how do I get to my desired goal as quickly as possible in my breeding program.
Question came up with how many deer did you look at in this training sample in this population of animals? Tell everybody about that.
Thousands. Thousands of deer in the reference training population from all over the United States, from the Northeast, including Pennsylvania, the Midwest, including Wisconsin, Iowa, Texas, in the South, all of the populations that were indemnified, depopulated, and some that weren't indemnified but were depopulated are in the training data.
So this information you have is based upon a national group of a giant group of deer, not
Yes.
just one region,
Right.
but looking at characteristics that showed susceptibility. I mean, that's what it is.
Right.
I mean, you're able to average it out.
Yeah, and we don't have enough time on this show to go into all the details, but I put them together and analyzed it. I took them apart and analyzed it. I put them into a machine learning approach and analyzed it. I did blind predictions on it. And no matter what, I keep coming up with the same answer. So it's not like today the answer is this, and tomorrow I'm going to tell you the answer is something else. No matter what I do, it comes down to the same thing over and over again. The heritability is high. That means that the majority of the risk or susceptibility can be explained by genetics. Usually we see that decay a bit when we start adding more and more and more samples into the training population. The rate of decay, the burn rate on the decay of the heritability is extraordinarily low. It's just solid high, which means, I mean, it's actually good news. It means that through selective breeding, you can really reduce your susceptibility burden among your breeding animals. And why not? If you're going to select the codons anyway, and you get one more piece of information, why not use it to your advantage? It doesn't make any sense not to.
We have a reliable way to make our deer less susceptible to CWD.
Right.
At some point down the road, I know I've heard breeders say we lose so many more deer to EHD than CWD. Will some type of test, you think, in the future come up to be able to predict susceptibility to EHD?
I think so, but it actually, and this might blow your mind, but it's actually more difficult to do for EHD. And the reason is that, you know, when people do have an EHD outbreak, they might do diagnostics and necropsies and post a few deer, but they don't do all of them. They just assume that everything that's affected is affected by that. And so EHD gets blamed for more dead loss than it actually is causing. And in order to make it work for the breeders so that the accuracy is good and true, we would have to make sure that all the deer had appropriate diagnostics. Because for CWD, it's very simple. If the IHC test is positive, then it's diagnostically positive, right? There's no ambiguity there. And all the deer are being post-mortem tested, right? And so it's easier for that reason. We just need to organize ourselves in the way of EHD observational data with appropriate diagnostics, and we can do it. But it requires precision disease data going into the training. Otherwise, it won't produce precision coming out.
Okay. Here's a question that seems to come up often, that in herds that have come down with a positive, and that they go in there and they test the animals. How come some of the animals with a low breeding value they've tested positive, where the animals with a higher haven't tested positive?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one mistake that people make when pondering that question is that they make assumptions about the mode of transmission or how they got CWD, right? So if I've got 5 deer that have CWD in a pen, and they have, you know, better breeding values than some that don't have CWD in a pen, you know, what is the explanation for that? Well, I mean, there's so many ways I think that CWD can be transmitted, and you can't assume that every deer in that pen got equally exposed to whatever's causing CWD in these deer. If, for instance, let's just have a pretend scenario. Let's pretend that I go over and provide some service on that farm, and I'm, you know, like live testing, for instance, right? You know, all those instruments and everything, they need to be cleaned appropriately to be disinfected, or you need to have your own stuff on site. You know, it's plausible that any type of mechanical issue that I brought with me, if I had been working on a herd that had CWD and it was on my instruments and those were the first 5 deer that I touched, it's possible that I could have a large enough dose to affect them, but not the rest of the deer, right? I mean, Ed Hoover already showed that there does seem to be a dose that deer can tolerate and a dose that they can't tolerate. He's showed that if he gives deer 300 nanograms of CWD in one shot, all of them get it. If he gives them across a 10-week period, 30 nanograms of CWD times 10 weeks, which equals 300, none of them get it across the observational time period, which was almost 30 months, I think. So I don't think that you can, first of all, I don't think you can assume that all deer in a pen in that situation were equally exposed. I think you have to start looking at what do these deer also have in common. Were they all bred by the same buck? Were they all handled in some other way, mechanically, There is some new research that I've been doing. There is some genetic evidence that, that CWD, there may be some genetic factors that could increase the probability that a sporadic event could occur in terms of refolding the prion protein in deer. We find some comparative evidence for that, just like people found comparative evidence of scrapie in sheep and they wanted to only look at the codons in deer. There seems to be some comparative evidence that that might be possible, and that if it was, it would be enriched in family units of deer that are closely related to one another. And that would also mesh with the high heritability that we know is there. So some of that new discovery, some of that new content is either on the array already or will be on the array soon when we make an update to the array. So there's more than one explanation for this question that you're asking. I mean, another thing that you could ask yourself is, in the food that deer are consuming, if the agent was present there, would you assume that it would be equally distributed across all of the food that the deer is eating, or would you assume that it would be concentrated in some parts and not in others?
See, it could be argued either way. And there's so many people, you go to one of these talks at a deer deal, and everybody, I guess the frustrating thing is, how did it get there?
Yeah, we don't always know.
Right.
There's just too many ways for it to get there. And so that's part of the problem, is that you're trying to ponder a simple answer to a very complicated question, and there's too many variables there. So trying to figure that out is not, it's not figurable. What you should also ask yourself is, all right, look, if I calculate the average breeding value from all the data, all the reference training population data, right, for the non-detects, which are paired with the positive deer from the same places, right? If I calculate the average breeding value for the non-detects and the average breeding value for the positive deer, you would expect that the differences would be statistically significant, right? That they should be different. You could predict what they would be, right? The positive should have positive breeding values on average, and the non-detect should have negative breeding values on average, right?
Yep.
They do. When we do that, that's what we get. And it is highly statistically significant because the sample size is large.
So it doesn't matter how it got there. It's there.
Yes.
That's the way I look at it. Is if you've got it, you've got it.
Right.
Doesn't matter if a bird brought it in or a coyote.
And
or
that could
water.
happen. Yeah.
And
that too could happen.
All those are ways that
Yep.
it can be brought in. But the deal is, if your deer are less susceptible to it, that's what you're working towards.
And as we live and we work in non-traditional livestock, as we live and work in an environment that probably has increasingly low levels of the agent around that can be distributed by birds, as you said, and various other ways, the only way we can't control the environment. We can control the genetic composition of the animals that we breed. And one of the things we do in traditional livestock is called genetic improvement, where we purposely select for animals that that more efficiently produce, that produce more, and that are healthier. Healthy animals produce better. This is the exact same thing. It's just instead of doing it in cattle, we're doing it in deer.
Looking at the codons, is a negative G a better deer than a positive S?
If I was a breeder, the answer to that question to me would be yes. As long as I could get that good negative G bred to an animal with S, and then I wouldn't keep that G around after I successfully move its good genetic background into some fawns where I can put at least one S on it. And like I said, H is the second best. Some people favor HS deer, but not all HS deer are created equally. When I look at HS deer, they're not common. You really have to make them. They're just not out there. You have to breed for them. And when I look at HS deer, their breeding values span the range. I looked at, I don't know, maybe 10 of them the other day, and I saw that some were failing the cutoff real bad. Some were close to the cutoff but not passing. Some were passing, and some were very much passing the cutoff. And so, you're only talking about two pieces of information, H and S. And there's tens of thousands of other pieces of genetic information that go into those calculations. So what I saw was exactly what I expected to see. Not all HSs are created equally. If you want to know that you're dealing with a good HS, you need to have the breeding value for it, right?
All right, so let's talk about the age of a deer herd. I want to look at a lot of historically, and most breeders out there know who has been unfortunate come down with CWD. The herds are old.
Yeah.
They've been around a long time. Okay, many of those animals are ancient, but they've got unbelievable genetics if you extract the breeding value, the susceptibility out of there. They've got unbelievable genetics. That's why they're old and
right.
kept around. But they've got positives on their farm. Okay, it would be safe, I would assume, that you want younger deer in your program. If you're going to do this breeding value and you're going to use this as a tool to breed, I would assume that to get the lowest number that you can, you want to turn as many deer through your program as you can, breeding towards that lower, below the cutoff number. Is that
right.
correct?
Yeah, and don't stop there. Just keep going. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One is to get there faster, and another is, we know in people, old people get dementia. Old people get diseases that are related to prion diseases, right? So if the same thing can happen in other species and there's genetic enrichment for that, it's probably not a good idea, right? So I think that turning your herd over is useful, if for no other reason, for you to rapidly breed your deer in that negative direction. And I think that's what you should do.
If this wasn't available, if this type of breeding opportunity wasn't available, how long do you think it would take in Mother Nature for CWD to kind of get bred out of the herd, so to speak?
Yeah, somebody tried to estimate that, and a lot of assumptions went into the statistics for that, but the best educated guess was hundreds and hundreds of years. And the reason is that when diseases are not aggressive or virulent enough to stop reproduction, then the selective advantage of an animal being resistant is low. Because if it doesn't preclude reproduction, it's not a species limiting factor, right?
So when they say CWD is always fatal, the thing about it is the deer will breed, they'll have more offspring and more offspring before, if it was terminal, before they would die, right?
Yeah, it's not rate limiting to reproduction. It's just like some people ask, if bison in Yellowstone National Park have had, brucellosis for, more than 100 years, why aren't they resistant to it by now? The answer to that question is the same as the answer to this. The Mother Nature's selective advantage for being resistant is not advantageous enough, right? Because it doesn't having the disease doesn't completely preclude reproduction. It doesn't rate limit the perpetuation of that species. And so the advantage of being completely resistant is not big enough to accelerate that through Mother Nature, right? So what we're doing is we are essentially accelerating that process by looking at the genetics, understanding and realizing what genetics increase susceptibility and which go the other way, and we're selecting to go the other way. That's the best we can do. There's also kind of another myth out there that this type of genetic selection is only going to cause the deer to live longer and then shed more into the environment, right? Mm-hmm. That's something that I've heard people say. Well, if you're going to do this genetic selection, all you're really doing is inducing some tolerance into the deer where they're going to live longer and shed more. To which I say, show me the evidence that you have for that, because I'll show you the evidence that we have. We are directly selecting on genetic elements, including 96S, that we know resists amplification of the normal deer prion protein into PRP CWD. And we know that from our own research, but we importantly know that from other people's research, like Debbie McKenzie in Canada, who did a molecular study and showed that actually the 96S allele, it won't template efficiently refolding of the normal prion protein when it comes into contact with PRP CWD. So not only did we know that from our statistical analysis, we know that from her molecular study, right? And so we are directly selecting on things that reduce the efficiency of refolding the normal prion protein into PRP CWD. So you can't shed what you don't amplify, other than what might already be in the environment, right? And so I don't think it's fair to say that you're only selecting animals that are going to live longer, but they're going to shed all over the environment. No, because we are selecting on genetic features that not only reduce susceptibility, but have reduced efficiency in amplifying the agent. And so I think that's an important distinction to be made.
So as I said earlier, I am very bullish on our industry, and I am excited about all this technology, this science, if you will, this trait that we're now able to look at. We can use it. This is a tool that you can use it to, if you want to use it or not. It's available through NADAR, and I'm excited about it. But if you were a deer breeder, okay, what would you be trying to do, and how aggressive would you be?
Well, I would be breeding in the negative direction as fast as I can and getting rid of the 96 Gs. I don't mind keeping H's around. I don't even mind keeping K's around. K's have a weak protective effect. Keeping some H's and K's around to some degree protects against what we call strain selection. If you make the deer too genetically homogenized, then you select for certain strains of CWD, we think. But moving in that negative direction, I think there's faster ways to get there, like looking at your animals and knowing how to get there. I mean, if you have deer that have good negative breeding values and you can put an S on the fawns, some of those are going to produce, some of those matings will produce fawns that outperform the parents, going in the right direction. Any other trait that you've been working on, certain pairings work better than others. And so you just have to get in there and do that and start in a good place. Start in a good place because you as a breeder, you know your own business practices, you know where you live, you know how much CWD is likely to be around you. You have to do your own risk assessment about how aggressive you want to be.
I want to tell you all thank you for watching the video. And if you've got any questions, you can contact the North American Deer Registry. If you're not a member of the North American Deer Registry, you need to, in my opinion, you need to become a member. And you can by joining NADEFA, North American Deer Farmers Association, or the Texas Deer Association, or Venado de Mexico. But by being a member of NADAR, you will wind up getting so much valuable information, and it's nothing more than a tool. And so That's the reason why I'm so bullish on the industry. So what do you see the future for CWD and all this technology? What do you see in the future for it?
In a way, it's a repeat of other industries in livestock where we started using these SNP arrays, and the whole dairy AI business was completely revolutionized by that because we didn't need traditional evaluations or EPDs. We didn't need to wait for a young bull to have many offspring so that we could, know what the genetic merit was. When we started doing genomic predictions with SNP arrays, we could do it at any time and know the predicted merit of that animal. So it accelerated the rate of genetic change for the positive in the dairy AI business, but people were resistant a little bit at first. I think we're going to have growing pains like that. I think the people that get out there in front of it and get aggressive about it are going to be in a much better place in the future than those who don't. I think that there'll come a point in time where this will have to be done, or, I think CWD's out there and it's certainly not staying stagnant in its geographic position. So I think that without this, we're going to be facing just a continued spread of the disease across the landscape. I don't know of any other way on the horizon to reduce the prevalence more quickly than this. I haven't seen anything else that would perform as well as this, or I would recommend it. If there was, in fact, a vaccine that was right on the horizon and I saw the data and it looked good, I would recommend it. But I don't know of anything else that will give us the performance that we're looking for other than this.
And science is going to push forward. You can't stop technology, you just can't stop science. It's going to push forward. And there's going to be more advancements coming up down the road. But this genetic breeding value is the best tool that we have right now to take the susceptibility of your herd down for CWD. I'd like to thank y'all for watching. You got any questions, contact the North American Deer Registry. Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
So I hope you found this video informative. If you have any questions or comments, you know what to do. Go ahead and post them below. And I hope on the next video, we'll wind up getting to those and answering them. I want to thank you for watching. Make sure, like the video, share it with your friends, and we'll see you next time. Okay, so you've got property and you're wanting to build. Maybe a barn dominium, maybe deer facilities, or maybe a badass lodge. Well, you've got to check out Rafter P Construction. Rafter P Construction is the leading design-build contractor across the state of Texas. Specializing in quality farm and ranch design-build projects, Rafter P Construction encourages their customers to be very hands-on, incorporating your input into every aspect of your project with their in-house design teams. The goal of Rafter P Construction is to be your builder for life. Rafter P Construction, they'll be with you every step of the way to build your dream project, all the while keeping quality and customer satisfaction at the forefront.